He thought he was walking alone, but somewhere in the quiet dark behind him, a pair of amber eyes had already chosen not to leave. The bus station lights hummed softly in the cold Colorado dawn as Daniel Hayes stepped down onto the cracked concrete, his boots landing with the slow heaviness of a man who had carried too much road behind him. It was 4:30 in the morning, the hour when towns felt half forgotten, and even the wind seemed unsure whether to wake the day or let the night linger a little longer. A thin mist hung over the empty parking lot, carrying the faint smell of diesel, wet asphalt, and pine drifting down from the mountains beyond town. Daniel adjusted the strap of the worn canvas duffel on his shoulder and paused for a moment, scanning the quiet street the way soldiers do without thinking, eyes moving across rooftops, alleyways, reflections in windows. Old habits rarely asked permission to stay. The town of Red Hollow wasn't much more than a few diners, a gas station, and a hardware store that opened when the owner felt like it. But that was exactly why Daniel had chosen it. Quiet places didn't ask questions. Quiet places didn't expect answers. He exhaled slowly, watching the breath drift into the pale morning air, and began walking toward the gravel road that led out of town. His pickup truck waited 2 blocks away behind a shuttered feed store, the same truck he had driven across nearly 300 miles of winding highway the night before. Every step echoed lightly on the pavement, the rhythm steady, deliberate, like a man measuring distance not just in yards but in memories. What Daniel didn't see was the movement beneath the shadow of a parked delivery van across the lot. A large German shepherd stepped forward just enough for the dim light to touch the edge of his coat, sable fur dark as the fading night. The dog didn't bark, didn't run toward him. He simply watched. His ears stood tall, listening to every footstep Daniel made as the Marine crossed the empty street and disappeared around the corner. For a few seconds the lot returned to silence, the wind rustling a loose flyer taped to a lamppost, the distant creak of a sign swaying above the bus depot door. Then the dog moved. Quiet. Controlled. Each step careful on the cold pavement as he followed the same path Daniel had taken. 50 yards behind. Maybe 60. Far enough not to be noticed. Close enough never to lose the trail. Daniel reached the gravel road and stopped beside his truck, fishing the keys from his pocket while the sky slowly softened from black to deep blue. The mountains along the horizon looked like shadows cut from the earth itself. He tossed the duffel into the passenger seat and rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment before turning the key. The engine coughed once, then settled into a steady rumble. As the truck rolled forward onto the empty highway leading toward the foothills, Daniel allowed himself one quiet thought. No more attachments. No more partners. No more looking back. The road stretched ahead of him for miles of open country, pale lines disappearing into pine forest and rising mountain slopes. And behind the truck, just beyond the reach of the headlights, the German shepherd began to run, steady and silent, as if he had already decided that wherever the Marine was going, he would not let him go there alone. The highway unwound slowly beneath the tires of Daniel Hayes's old pickup truck, a thin gray ribbon stretching through the quiet Colorado foothills as the first light of morning crept across the sky. Pine trees lined both sides of the road, tall and dark, their branches whispering in the early wind that slid down from the mountains. The truck's engine hummed with a steady rhythm, the kind of low mechanical sound that filled silence without breaking it. Daniel drove with both hands resting loosely on the wheel, eyes forward, posture calm, but alert in that quiet way soldiers carried even when there was no battlefield in sight. The town of Red Hollow had disappeared behind him nearly 15 miles ago, leaving nothing but open country and scattered ranch fences that faded into the pale horizon. A faded thermos rolled lightly on the passenger seat beside his canvas duffel, bumping gently every time the truck crossed a crack in the road. Daniel did not reach for it. Instead, he watched the road and listened to the wind brushing across the side mirrors. Solitude had a sound of its own, and this morning it felt almost peaceful. Far behind the truck, just beyond the faint dust drifting from the tires, the German shepherd continued his steady run. The dog's breathing was controlled and quiet, each stride smooth and practiced as if long-distance travel was something he understood well. His coat caught the early light now and then, revealing streaks of deep sable mixed with warm brown across his shoulders. His ears stayed upright, tracking the sound of the truck's engine ahead like a compass guiding his path. He did not rush. He did not panic when the truck grew smaller in the distance. He simply followed, step after step, mile after mile, as though the decision had already been made long before the Marine ever started the engine. The highway curved gradually toward the foothills, where patches of morning fog drifted between the trees and the scent of damp earth hung in the air. Daniel finally slowed the truck as a small roadside diner came into view, the kind of place that looked unchanged for 20 years. A crooked wooden sign swung gently above the gravel lot, painted with the words Mountain Ridge Coffee in faded red letters. A single pickup truck sat parked near the front window, and inside the diner a warm yellow glow spilled out across the empty parking area. Daniel pulled in and shut off the engine, the sudden silence settling around him like a blanket. For a moment he remained in the driver's seat, watching steam rise faintly from the hood in the cool morning air. Then he stepped out, stretching his shoulders slightly as the gravel crunched beneath his boots. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the diner door the moment he opened it, rich and warm against the chill outside. A woman behind the counter glanced up with a polite smile and slid a mug beneath the coffee pot without asking what he wanted. Travelers in places like this rarely needed menus. Daniel nodded once in quiet thanks and sat at the end of the counter near the window, the mug warming his hands as he stared out toward the empty road he had just driven. He did not notice the movement at the far edge of the gravel lot, where the German Shepherd had stopped just beyond the reach of the diner lights. The dog lowered himself quietly beside a weathered fence post, watching the doorway with calm patience. His chest rose and fell slowly after the long run, but his eyes never left the building. Inside, Daniel Hayes took his first sip of coffee and believed the morning belonged only to him, unaware that somewhere in the shadows beyond the glass, loyalty had already chosen to stay close. Daniel Hayes finished the last swallow of coffee and set the mug gently on the counter, the ceramic making a quiet sound that blended with the low hum of the refrigerator behind the diner bar. The warmth had spread slowly through his chest, chasing away the thin mountain chill that still clung to the morning. Outside the window the sky had brightened into a pale silver blue, and sunlight now touched the tops of the pines that lined the highway beyond the gravel lot. The woman behind the counter wiped her hands on a towel and glanced toward him with the calm curiosity of someone who had watched many travelers pass through this place over the years. Daniel left a few folded bills beneath the mug, nodded politely, and stepped back outside into the cool air. The gravel crunched under his boots as he crossed the lot toward the truck, the wind carrying the scent of pine needles and distant wood smoke drifting from a cabin somewhere down the valley. He opened the driver's side door and paused for a moment before climbing in, letting his eyes sweep the empty roadside out of habit. There were no cars passing, no movement along the highway, only the quiet rustle of trees shifting in the breeze. Satisfied, he started the engine and guided the pickup back onto the road, the tires rolling slowly through the thin layer of dust that had settled overnight. At the far edge of the lot, the German Shepherd lifted his head the moment the engine sound returned. The dog rose from beside the fence post with calm patience, stretching his long legs once before stepping forward again. His amber eyes followed the truck as it pulled away and merged onto the empty highway, growing smaller with each passing second. For a brief moment the dog stood still, nose lifted into the wind, as if confirming the direction of the trail. Then he began to run again. His stride was smooth and steady, paws landing softly along the gravel shoulder before shifting onto the packed dirt beside the road where the ground was easier beneath his feet. The morning sun warmed his back as he moved through patches of light and shadow cast by the tall pine trees. The truck was already nearly half a mile ahead, but the German Shepherd did not appear worried about distance. He ran with quiet confidence, guided not by sight alone, but by the steady scent the truck left drifting through the mountain air. Inside the cab, Daniel drove deeper into the foothills, the road beginning to curve more sharply as it climbed toward higher ground. Small wooden signs for hiking trails appeared along the roadside now, along with narrow dirt roads branching toward scattered cabins hidden in the forest. Daniel slowed once to check a worn map folded across the passenger seat, then turned onto a narrower gravel path that disappeared between thick rows of trees. The truck rolled slowly along the uneven road for nearly another mile before a small clearing opened ahead. A weathered cabin stood near the center of the clearing, its wooden walls sun-faded and quiet beneath the tall pines surrounding it. Daniel parked the truck beside a stack of old firewood and stepped out, breathing deeply as the clean mountain air filled his lungs. The place was silent except for the wind brushing through the trees and the distant call of a hawk somewhere high above the valley. He looked around the clearing, satisfied with the solitude, and carried his duffel toward the cabin door. What Daniel Hayes did not notice was the movement far back along the gravel road, where the German shepherd slowed his run and slipped quietly into the tree line. The dog moved between the shadows of the pines with practiced patience until he reached the edge of the clearing. There he stopped once more, sitting quietly beneath the cover of branches, watching the cabin with calm, steady eyes as if guarding a promise that the Marine had not yet realized was still being kept. The cabin door creaked softly as Daniel Hayes pushed it open, the old hinges complaining after what must have been months without use. A thin beam of morning light slipped through the doorway and stretched across the wooden floorboards, revealing a room that smelled faintly of pine dust and dry air. The place was simple, almost bare. A small iron stove rested near the far wall. A narrow bed stood beneath a window that looked out toward the trees, and a rough wooden table sat in the center of the room with two mismatched chairs beside it. Daniel stepped inside slowly, setting his duffel bag down near the table while his eyes scanned the corners out of quiet habit. Old instincts moved through him like muscle memory, checking the windows, the door frame, the shadows beneath the bed. Nothing stirred except the soft rustle of wind outside brushing against the cabin walls. Satisfied, he exhaled quietly and moved to open the window, letting the mountain air drift inside. It carried the scent of pine needles warming under the rising sun and the faint earthy smell of damp soil somewhere beyond the clearing. For the first time in days, Daniel allowed his shoulders to relax. The silence here felt deeper than the silence on the highway. It was the kind that wrapped around a man and asked nothing from him. Outside, the clearing remained still beneath the tall pines. Sunlight filtered through the branches in long golden beams that shifted slowly across the ground. The German shepherd watched from the edge of the trees where the shadows were thickest. His body remained perfectly still, his ears lifting slightly each time a new sound reached him. He heard the creak of the cabin door, the soft thud of boots crossing wooden boards, the faint scrape of a chair being moved inside. Every sound told him the Marine was safe. The dog lowered himself onto the forest floor once more, resting his weight on his front paws while his eyes remained fixed on the cabin. The distance between them was no more than 50 yards now, but he did not step closer. Patience had always been part of his nature. Inside the cabin, Daniel unpacked slowly, placing a folded jacket over the chair and setting a small metal flashlight beside the bed. From the side pocket of his duffel, he removed a worn silver chain that held 2 military dog tags. The metal clicked softly against the table as he set them down for a moment, his fingers resting on them longer than necessary. Sunlight from the window caught the edge of the tags and reflected a faint glimmer across the tabletop. Daniel stared at them quietly, the distant memory of another place flickering behind his eyes. A different landscape, a different time. Then he closed his hand gently around the chain and slipped it back into the pocket of his bag, as if sealing the memory away again. Outside, the wind shifted direction, stirring the pine branches and carrying new scents through the clearing. The German shepherd lifted his nose slightly, testing the air the way trained dogs often do when reading the invisible language drifting through the forest. The smell of wood smoke from an old chimney lingered faintly around the cabin. Beneath that was the steady scent of the Marine himself, familiar and unmistakable. The dog's amber eyes softened for just a moment as he watched the cabin door. Somewhere deep within that quiet animal patience lived a memory of footsteps marching beside him, of commands spoken in a calm, steady voice, of long roads walked side by side. The dog did not move closer yet. He simply waited beneath the trees, guarding the silence around the clearing as though the Marine inside had never truly been alone. The afternoon sun drifted slowly across the clearing, warming the cabin roof and filling the forest with the quiet hum of insects beginning their daily rhythm. Inside, Daniel Hayes moved through the small space with the calm patience of someone settling into temporary solitude. He gathered a few fallen branches from the stack beside the door and arranged them neatly near the iron stove, though the day was still warm enough that he did not need to light it. The habit of preparation had been part of him for too long to ignore. Outside the open window, the wind moved gently through the pine needles, carrying the steady whisper of the forest as if the mountains themselves were breathing. Daniel stepped out onto the narrow porch and leaned against the wooden railing, letting the quiet stretch around him. From here, he could see nearly the entire clearing, the gravel road disappearing back into the trees where he had arrived earlier that morning. It felt distant now, like another world that belonged to someone else. He rested his arms on the railing and closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the sounds of the forest the way a man might listen to distant waves. A hawk circled somewhere above the treetops. A small stream murmured faintly beyond the slope behind the cabin. It was the kind of silence that allowed thoughts to drift slowly, carefully, without forcing them to the surface. At the edge of the trees, the German shepherd remained hidden beneath the shade of the tall pines. From his place between the roots of a fallen log, he watched the Marine standing on the porch. The dog's posture was calm, but every small movement of the clearing registered in his awareness. The creak of the wooden railing, the rhythm of the man's breathing, the distant wing beat of the hawk above. Time passed quietly while the dog waited, the sunlight shifting across the clearing inch by inch. Eventually Daniel pushed himself away from the railing and stepped down into the grass, stretching his back slightly as he walked a slow circle around the cabin. The grass was dry and pale from weeks without rain, bending softly beneath his boots. He followed the edge of the clearing toward the tree line, studying the forest in the thoughtful way of someone memorizing the land around him. From inside the shadows, the German shepherd lowered his head slightly, remaining perfectly still as the Marine approached within 40 yards. The scent of pine and warm earth filled the air between them, along with the familiar trace of the man himself carried gently by the breeze. The dog's ears lifted as Daniel paused near the edge of the clearing and looked out into the forest. For a brief moment their distance felt smaller than the trees that separated them. Daniel studied the quiet woods, his eyes moving slowly across the rows of tall trunks and dark spaces between them. Something about the forest made him pause longer than expected, as if he sensed a presence without understanding why. The breeze shifted again, rustling the pine branches above and scattering a few dry needles across the ground. Then Daniel shook his head lightly and turned back toward the cabin, dismissing the faint feeling as nothing more than the imagination of a man and used to such deep silence. He walked back across the clearing and disappeared inside the cabin once more. Beneath the shade of the trees, the German shepherd remained where he was, his amber eyes watching the door close gently behind the Marine. The dog did not move forward yet. He only settled back into the forest floor, patient and steady, as if guarding a quiet promise that had begun long before the man ever arrived in this mountain clearing. Evening arrived quietly in the mountains, the sunlight fading slowly behind the tall ridge that stood beyond the clearing like a silent wall of stone. The air cooled as the day slipped toward dusk, and long shadows stretched across the grass around the cabin. Inside, Daniel Hayes sat at the small wooden table with the window open beside him, watching the forest darken inch by inch. A lantern rested on the table, casting a soft amber glow that flickered gently against the wooden walls. The smell of pine drifted in through the window along with the distant sound of the small stream flowing somewhere beyond the slope. Daniel had not turned on the radio. He had not reached for his phone. The quiet was enough. He leaned back slightly in the chair and let the calm settle over him like a blanket. For a moment his eyes drifted toward the pocket of his duffel bag resting near the bed. The faint outline of the metal dog tags was still visible beneath the fabric. Daniel looked away again, as if some memories were better left resting in the dark. Outside the clearing, the forest had begun to shift into its nighttime rhythm. The breeze moved slower now, and the last birds of the evening passed overhead before disappearing into the deeper woods. Beneath the pine trees, the German shepherd lifted his head as the temperature dropped with the fading sun. The scent of the forest changed with the coming night. Cooler air carried sharper details through the branches, the smell of damp earth, distant water, and the faint trace of smoke from the cabin chimney, where Daniel had finally lit a small fire inside the stove. The dog rose slowly from the forest floor and stepped forward a few careful paces. His paws moved quietly over the carpet of pine needles as he approached the edge of the clearing once more. The cabin windows glowed softly now, warm squares of light against the darkening forest. The dog stopped just beyond the tree line, watching the building with steady amber eyes. Inside, Daniel stood and moved toward the window to stretch his back after sitting too long. The fire inside the stove crackled gently, sending small waves of warmth through the room. He looked out toward the clearing again, scanning the tree line the way he had earlier that afternoon. Something about the forest at night always sharpened the senses. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper now, the spaces wider. For a brief second Daniel thought he noticed movement near the edge of the clearing, but when he focused his eyes there was nothing but branches swaying softly in the evening breeze. He gave a quiet breath and closed the window halfway, letting only a thin ribbon of cool air drift into the room. Outside, the German shepherd had already stepped back into the shadows again, his body blending perfectly with the darkness beneath the pines. The dog circled slowly once before lowering himself to the ground again, facing the cabin with calm patience. His ears remained upright, listening to every small sound from within the wooden walls. The creak of a chair, the soft clink of metal as the Marine set something down on the table, the gentle rhythm of footsteps crossing the floor. The night deepened around the clearing while the forest settled into silence. Stars began to appear above the dark outline of the mountain ridge, faint at first, and then brighter with every passing minute. The cabin remained the only light for miles, glowing quietly beneath the tall pines. And just beyond that circle of warm light, the German shepherd kept his silent watch, as though the promise guiding him across the miles of road earlier that day had not yet been fulfilled. The night settled fully over the mountain clearing, and the forest seemed to grow deeper with every passing hour. Inside the cabin, the lantern still glowed softly beside the iron stove, its warm light flickering across the wooden walls like quiet waves. Daniel Hayes had moved to the narrow bed beneath the window, though sleep had not come easily. The silence out here was different from the silence of cities or highways. It was fuller, alive in a way that made every small sound carry farther through the darkness. Daniel lay on his back staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the steady rhythm of the wind brushing through the tall pines outside. Now and then the stove shifted with a soft metallic tick as the fire inside settled into glowing embers. Somewhere far beyond the clearing an owl called once, its low echo drifting across the mountains before fading into the distance. Daniel turned his head slightly toward the window where the faint light of the stars shone between the branches. Something about the forest at night had always stirred old instincts in him, the sense that the world never truly slept, that something somewhere was always watching, always listening. Outside the cabin, the German shepherd remained at the edge of the clearing where the darkness beneath the trees gave him perfect cover. The dog had not moved far since the lantern inside the cabin dimmed, and the Marine lay down to rest. His body rested low against the forest floor, but his eyes remained open, reflecting small sparks of starlight each time he lifted his head to listen. The wind carried dozens of scents through the trees. Cold earth, pine sap, the distant stream running along the slope. Beneath all of it was the steady familiar scent of the man inside the cabin. The dog recognized it the way one recognizes a voice remembered from long ago. Time passed slowly beneath the quiet sky, while the mountains held their breath. Hours slipped by as the stars turned across the darkness. The German shepherd rose once to walk a slow circle along the outer edge of the clearing, his steps silent on the soft ground. His ears shifted with every faint sound in the forest. The rustle of a rabbit moving through brush. The distant crack of a branch somewhere deeper in the trees. Each signal passed through his awareness before settling again into stillness. When he finished his quiet patrol, he returned to his place beneath the shadow of the pines, facing the cabin once more. Inside, Daniel finally drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Memories often traveled with him into the quiet hours of night, fragments of distant places and long roads behind him. Tonight was no different. Somewhere between sleep and waking, his mind wandered back toward the desert wind of another country and the echo of footsteps marching beside him. Then the dream faded slowly as the cold air shifted outside the cabin window. Daniel stirred slightly in the bed, but did not wake. The lantern beside the stove flickered one last time before its flame finally dimmed to darkness. The cabin now rested beneath the same blanket of night that covered the forest around it. Yet the clearing was not empty. Beyond the reach of the cabin walls and the sleeping Marine inside, the German shepherd continued his silent watch beneath the trees, patient, steady, as though the road that had brought him here was only the beginning of something he had already decided would never end. The cold hour before dawn arrived quietly over the mountain clearing, the sky still dark, but slowly softening along the distant ridge where morning would soon begin. Inside the cabin, Daniel Hayes shifted slightly in his sleep as the last warmth from the iron stove faded into the room. The air had grown cooler during the night, carrying the crisp scent of pine and damp soil through the narrow crack in the window. Daniel's breathing remained slow and steady, though his mind drifted near the surface of waking now. The forest outside was beginning to change again. The night sounds had softened, and the first faint stirrings of morning life moved through the trees. Somewhere far off a bird called once, testing the edge of the coming light. Beneath the tall pines, the German shepherd lifted his head immediately at the subtle shift in the forest's rhythm. The dog had not truly slept. His body rested, but his awareness remained sharp through the long hours of darkness. Now the cool air carried a new layer of scent drifting through the clearing. The faint smell of frost on the grass, the distant trace of water moving along the mountain stream, and the steady familiar presence of the Marine inside the cabin. The dog rose slowly to his feet and stretched his long frame, his paws pressing softly into the layer of pine needles that covered the forest floor. For the first time since arriving, he stepped a little closer toward the clearing. His movement remained careful, controlled, each step placed with quiet precision. The sky above the ridge was beginning to turn a pale gray-blue when the dog reached the outer edge of the grass. From here the cabin stood only 30 yards away, its wooden walls still dim beneath the fading stars. The dog paused and watched the silent building, his amber eyes reflecting the faint light of dawn. Inside, Daniel stirred again and opened his eyes slowly. For a moment he did not move, listening to the stillness around him as he often did when waking in unfamiliar places. The quiet here felt deep but calm. He sat up on the edge of the bed and rubbed a hand across his face before standing to stretch his shoulders. The wooden floor creaked lightly beneath his steps as he crossed the room and pushed the window open the rest of the way. Cool mountain air rushed inside, carrying the scent of morning and the gentle whisper of wind through the pines. Daniel rested his hands on the window frame and looked out across the clearing. The grass shimmered faintly with dew under the dim, early light. The forest beyond remained shadowed but peaceful. Then something caught his attention. A shape near the edge of the clearing. At first it seemed like nothing more than another dark patch of shadow beneath the trees. Daniel narrowed his eyes slightly and leaned forward against the window frame. The shape moved. Slow. Calm. The German shepherd stepped fully into the pale dawn light and stopped in the grass, his tall ears upright and his posture steady as he looked directly toward the cabin. Daniel froze where he stood, his mind still halfway between sleep and full awareness. For several quiet seconds neither of them moved. The clearing remained silent except for the wind stirring gently through the branches above. Daniel studied the dog with careful curiosity. The animal did not appear frightened or aggressive. He simply stood there watching with a calm patience that felt strangely familiar. Daniel exhaled slowly, still unsure how the dog had appeared here, so far from any road or town. Outside in the cool dawn light, the German shepherd held his ground and waited, as though the long journey that had brought him across miles of empty highway had finally led him exactly where he intended to be. Daniel Hayes remained still at the window for several quiet seconds, studying the German shepherd standing in the cool gray light of early morning. The dog did not move. He stood tall in the dew-covered grass with calm, steady posture, his ears lifted and his amber eyes focused directly on the cabin. There was no fear in the animal's stance, and no sign of aggression either. Only patience. Daniel felt a small tension rise in his chest, not from danger, but from the strange familiarity in the way the dog held himself. He had seen that posture before. Discipline. Awareness. The kind that came from long hours beside people who understood silence. Daniel pushed the cabin door open and stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking softly beneath his boots. The cold mountain air brushed across his face, carrying the clean scent of pine and wet grass. The dog watched him the entire time, but did not step forward or retreat. For a moment, neither of them spoke or moved. A man and an animal standing across a quiet clearing while the first light of the sun crept slowly down the mountainside behind them. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the porch railing and studied the dog more carefully now. The animal looked strong but lean, his coat thick and dark along the back with lighter brown along his legs and chest. There was a faint streak of gray around his muzzle that suggested he was no young stray wandering the mountains. Daniel stepped down from the porch and took a few slow steps into the grass. The dog remained where he was, though his ears shifted slightly, as if measuring every movement the man made. Daniel stopped when he was still about 20 yards away, close enough to see the animal clearly now. The dog's eyes held a quiet intelligence that felt almost human in its calm attention. Daniel spoke at last, his voice low and even. "Easy there, boy." The words drifted across the clearing without urgency. The German shepherd tilted his head slightly, listening. His body remained steady, but his tail gave the faintest movement through the tall grass. Daniel noticed something else then. Around the dog's neck rested a weathered leather collar, darkened with age but still intact. From the collar hung a small metal tag that caught the rising sunlight and flashed briefly like a signal. Daniel's eyes narrowed as he noticed it. Stray dogs did not usually carry tags this deep in the mountains. He took another slow step forward. The dog did not retreat. Instead, he sat down calmly in the grass, his gaze never leaving the Marine standing across from him. The movement was simple but deliberate, the kind of quiet obedience that comes from long training rather than chance. Daniel felt a faint stir of recognition somewhere deep in his memory, though he could not yet explain why. He crouched slightly and extended one hand in a relaxed gesture. "Come here." The German shepherd watched him for a moment longer as the sunlight finally reached the clearing and painted the grass in warm gold. Then the dog rose to his feet and walked forward slowly, his steps measured and calm until he stopped just a few yards away from the man. Daniel could now see the tag clearly hanging from the collar. The metal surface was worn but not unreadable. He leaned forward slightly and reached out to steady it between his fingers. The letters stamped into the metal were faint but unmistakable. Daniel felt his breath pause as the morning wind moved softly through the clearing around them. For the first time since the dog had appeared, the Marine realized this animal had not wandered here by accident. Daniel Hayes held the metal tag between his fingers while the morning breeze moved gently through the clearing. The dog stood quietly in front of him, patient and steady, as though he had waited a long time for this exact moment. The letters stamped into the worn metal were faint, but still clear enough to read. Daniel leaned closer, the sunlight catching the surface as his eyes followed each line carved into the tag. K9 unit. Beneath that was a number he recognized immediately. His breath slowed. For a moment the clearing seemed to fade around him, while memory returned like a distant echo across the years. Daniel released the tag slowly and looked up at the German shepherd's face. The dog met his gaze without hesitation, those amber eyes steady and calm in the golden light of early morning. Daniel searched the animal's features more carefully now. The strong shoulders, the thick sable coat, the faint gray around the muzzle, and something else deeper in the dog's expression that stirred a place in Daniel's mind he had tried not to visit for a long time. The Marine lowered himself slowly to one knee in the grass so that he was closer to the dog's height. The movement was instinctive, quiet, respectful. The German shepherd did not back away. Instead, he stepped one pace closer until he stood within arm's reach. Daniel studied the collar again, brushing a bit of dust away from the tag with his thumb. The number was unmistakable. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "That cannot be right." The dog's ears lifted slightly at the sound of his voice. Daniel looked back into the animal's eyes, searching for confirmation that felt impossible and yet strangely certain. Years ago, there had been another place, another mission, another long road through heat and wind where a dog had walked beside him with the same calm discipline. That dog had carried the same quiet watchfulness in his eyes. Daniel felt the old memory settle slowly into focus. He spoke again, this time more clearly, though his voice remained low and careful. "Atlas, The name drifted across the clearing like a small stone dropped into still water. For a second nothing happened. The German shepherd simply stood there, studying him. Then the dog's ears lifted fully upright, and his tail moved once through the grass. The reaction was small, but unmistakable. Daniel felt his chest tighten with a mix of disbelief and quiet wonder. Atlas had been part of a special K-9 unit years earlier, trained beside Marines for long patrols through difficult terrain. Daniel remembered the steady rhythm of that partnership. A dog who could read silence better than most people. A dog who walked miles without hesitation and watched every shadow as if it mattered. But Atlas had disappeared during a mission long ago. In the chaos of that distant day, the dog had vanished into the landscape, and no one had ever been certain what became of him afterward. Daniel had carried the quiet weight of that uncertainty ever since. Now the same dog stood before him in the mountain clearing, as if the years between had folded quietly into nothing. Daniel reached out slowly and rested his hand against the dog's neck, feeling the warmth of living fur beneath his palm. Atlas remained still, accepting the contact with calm familiarity. The wind moved gently through the pines above them, while the sun climbed higher over the ridge. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in many years. Somehow the road that had brought him to this lonely cabin had not been walked alone after all. Daniel Hayes kept his hand resting gently against the thick fur along Atlas's neck, while the morning sun continued to climb above the ridge. The warmth of the dog's coat beneath his palm felt solid and real, grounding him in a moment that still seemed almost impossible. Atlas stood calmly beside him, breathing slow and steady, his eyes scanning the clearing with the same quiet, discipline Daniel remembered from years before. For a while neither of them moved. The clearing remained peaceful beneath the tall pines while sunlight spread across the dew-covered grass. Daniel finally stood again, brushing his hand lightly along the dog's shoulder as he rose. He studied Atlas more carefully now, noticing the small details that time had added to the animal's face. The gray around the muzzle, a faint scar near the ear hidden beneath the fur. Signs of years that had passed since the last time they had walked side by side. Daniel shook his head slightly, still trying to make sense of it. He spoke softly as if thinking aloud. "You disappeared back there, boy. Everyone thought you were gone." Atlas watched him closely, his tail moving slowly through the grass. The dog did not bark or whine. He simply remained near Daniel's side with the quiet patience of an old partner who already understood more than words could explain. Daniel walked slowly toward the porch of the cabin, and Atlas followed without hesitation, keeping a respectful distance of a few steps behind. The sound of their footsteps through the grass felt strangely familiar to Daniel, as though a rhythm he had once known well had returned without asking permission. When Daniel reached the porch, he turned and looked down at the dog again. Atlas sat immediately, the motion smooth and natural. Daniel laughed softly under his breath, a sound that had not escaped him easily in a long time. Some habits never leave you, do they? The dog's ears lifted at the tone of Daniel's voice, and for the first time since the morning began, Daniel felt something inside his chest loosen slightly. He stepped into the cabin and returned a moment later carrying a small metal bowl. He filled it with water from the pump beside the door and set it down near the porch steps. Atlas approached calmly and drank, the quiet sound of water echoing softly in the still mountain air. Daniel leaned against the porch railing while watching him. The presence of the dog changed the feeling of the clearing in ways Daniel had not expected. The silence was no longer empty. It felt shared. Atlas finished drinking and sat once more near the steps, his gaze drifting across the forest as if continuing the silent watch he had kept through the night. Daniel followed the direction of the dog's eyes toward the tree line. The forest remained calm beneath the rising sun. Nothing moved except the gentle wind through the pine branches. Daniel crossed his arms against the railing and exhaled slowly. He had come here to be alone, to put distance between himself and everything that had followed him home from the past. Yet somehow the past had found him anyway, not as a burden, but as something steady and familiar standing quietly beside him. Atlas remained there in the grass below the porch, calm and watchful, as though he had always known the road would lead him back to the Marine he had never truly stopped following. The morning continued to unfold gently over the mountain clearing, the sunlight now reaching deeper into the forest and warming the wooden walls of the small cabin. Daniel Hayes sat on the porch steps with his forearms resting on his knees, while Atlas remained a few feet away in the grass, calmly watching the quiet world around them. The dog's posture carried the same quiet alertness Daniel remembered from years ago, the kind that never seemed tense, yet never truly relaxed either. Atlas had always been like that, a silent guardian who listened more than he moved. Daniel glanced toward the gravel road that disappeared between the tall pines and shook his head slightly, as if still trying to understand how the dog had found him again after all this time. Miles of highway, a forgotten town, a cabin hidden in the mountains. None of it had stopped Atlas from arriving exactly where Daniel had ended up. The Marine leaned back against the porch railing and studied the dog again. Atlas had aged, but the spirit behind those amber eyes had not faded. The loyalty was still there, steady and unwavering, like a compass that never lost its direction. Daniel spoke quietly, his voice carrying easily through the calm mountain air. "You tracked me all the way out here, did you not?" Atlas lifted his head at the sound, his tail brushing lightly through the grass. The dog did not answer, of course, but the look in his eyes said enough. Daniel remembered the long training days years earlier when Atlas had learned to follow a trail across miles of open land without hesitation. The dog had always been the best in the unit when it came to tracking. Patient, focused, determined in ways that sometimes felt almost human. Daniel let out a slow breath and looked across the clearing once more. The mountains stood tall and quiet around them while the wind moved gently through the pine branches overhead. He had come here to leave the past behind, yet somehow the past had arrived not as a burden but as a companion. Atlas rose from the grass and walked closer to the porch until he sat beside Daniel on the lowest step. The movement was smooth and familiar, as though he had taken that same place 1,000 times before. Daniel reached down and rested his hand on the dog's back again, feeling the steady warmth beneath the thick coat. For a long moment, they simply sat there together in silence while the forest breathed around them. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice softer now. "I guess you never stopped looking for me." Atlas tilted his head slightly, the sunlight catching the edge of his collar tag as it moved. Daniel's eyes drifted toward the distant road once more, then back to the dog sitting patiently beside him. Something inside him settled quietly into place. The loneliness that had followed him across miles of highway and into this quiet cabin no longer felt quite so heavy. Atlas had not come here by accident. He had followed a promise that neither time nor distance had broken. Daniel gave a small nod, as if accepting something that no longer needed explanation. The road ahead would still be quiet. The mountains would still be silent. But he would not be walking through them alone anymore. The sun had climbed high above the mountain ridge by midday, filling the clearing with warm light that filtered through the tall pines like quiet gold. Daniel Hayes remained seated on the porch steps with Atlas beside him, both of them watching the slow rhythm of the forest unfold around the cabin. The wind moved gently through the branches overhead, carrying the steady scent of pine and distant water from the mountain stream below the slope. For the first time since Daniel had arrived in this remote place, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt shared. Atlas rested calmly at his side, his posture relaxed yet attentive, the same balance Daniel had seen in him countless times during the years they had once worked together. Daniel leaned forward slightly and ran, his hand along the dog's back, brushing through the thick fur, while Atlas remained still beneath the touch. The simple contact carried more meaning than words could explain. Daniel stood slowly and stepped down into the grass, glancing toward the gravel road that wound through the trees. Atlas rose immediately and followed him without being asked, his movements smooth and familiar. Daniel walked a short distance into the clearing, then paused and looked back toward the cabin and the quiet forest beyond it. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, ridges fading into soft blue layers beneath the open sky. It was the kind of place where a man could start over without being followed by the noise of the world he had left behind. Daniel had believed that was exactly what he needed. Yet standing there with Atlas beside him, he realized something he had not expected. Starting over did not have to mean leaving everything behind. Sometimes it meant rediscovering the things that had never truly left. Atlas stepped closer until he stood beside Daniel's leg, his amber eyes scanning the distant tree line the way a seasoned partner always did. Daniel looked down at him and gave a small smile that had been absent from his face for a long time. "Guess you decided this is home now." Atlas's tail moved slowly through the grass in quiet agreement. Daniel took a deep breath of the cool mountain air and felt a calm settle over him that had not existed before that morning. The road that had led him here had been long and lonely, but somehow it had guided two travelers back to the same place again. Daniel turned toward the cabin and began walking back across the clearing. Atlas fell into step beside him naturally, the distance between them disappearing as if it had never existed at all. When they reached the porch, Daniel paused for a moment and looked out across the forest one last time. The mountains remained silent and steady, their vastness stretching beyond anything either of them could see. Daniel rested his hand once more on Atlas's shoulder and nodded quietly to himself. Whatever roads lay ahead through these mountains, they would walk them the same way they always had, side by side. And in that quiet clearing beneath the tall pines, the Marine who had come searching for solitude discovered that loyalty had followed him farther than he ever imagined.